This op-ed is about the solitary confinement of incarcerated individuals with disabilities. Solitary confinement, otherwise known as solitary, prison segregation, restrictive housing, and SHU or special housing unit, is the practice of placing people in closed cells with almost no human contact and very little sensory stimulation for at least 22 hours a day for a period of anywhere from a few days, 2 years, or even decades. The average period of time an individual spends in solitary confinement is 37 days. While the practice's defenders claim that it decreases violence, evidence suggests the opposite. It has been criticized as constituting torture by the UN and been shown to have severe negative psychological effects. Finally, while solitary confinement is supposed to be a punishment for violent behavior or other rule violation, many incarcerated individuals, especially individuals with disabilities, LGBTQ individuals, and Muslims, are placed in solitary for, quote, their own safety. This shows that an average solitary confinement cell is smaller than the standard porta potty. An estimated 80 to 100,000 incarcerated individuals are in solitary confinement in the U.S. In 2011 to 2012, almost 20% of prisoners and 18% of detainees in jail had already been in some type of restrictive housing by their first year. While there is no solid data for how many inmates with disabilities are in solitary confinement, we can assume that the number is quite high given how many individuals are in solitary confinement and how many incarcerated individuals have a disability. In 2016, the estimated population of incarcerated people with disabilities in prisons and jails was 750,000, or a full 30% of the incarcerated population. Cognitive disabilities were the most common at about 20 to 30% of the incarcerated population, while ambulatory disability was the second most common at around 10% of the inmate population. Vision-related disabilities affected around 7% of jail and prison inmates, while hearing-related disabilities affected around 6%. However, this figure does not even include incarcerated people with a serious mental illness or any mental health condition. In fact, 20% of incarcerated people suffer from a serious mental illness, and more than half of incarcerated individuals report at least one mental health condition. Interestingly, more women than men who are incarcerated have a disability, as this graph shows. A full 50% of women in jail have a disability, while 40% of women in prisons have a disability. This demonstrates very clearly the importance of looking at the intersection of disability, incarceration, and gender, especially given the fact that the rate at which women are being incarcerated in this country is increasing more quickly than the rate at which men are incarcerated, even though there are still more men in jails and prison than women. Key historical points about solitary confinement. So in 1983, the killing of 2 guards at Marion Federal Prison in Illinois resulted in it becoming the first de facto supermax prison in the U.S. In the 1970s and 1980s, prison overcrowding and an increase in prison violence contributed to making the circumstances ripe for a rapid adoption of the supermax model following the incident at Marion. By 2006, there were at least 57 supermax facilities. And another key point that's related to disability is the fact that around the same time, there was a deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities, which led to many individuals with serious mental health conditions being discharged from institutions. Many of them ended up becoming homeless and then caught up in the criminal justice system. As a result, many were incarcerated. And because guards and other prison staff had very little training on how to deal with mental illness, this led to many new inmates being placed in solitary confinement. And as you can see here, there's a really stark correlation between the population, the decreasing population at mental hospitals and the increasing prison and jail population in this country. And so the psychological effects of solitary confinement, as mentioned, are quite severe. Solitary confinement has been linked to suicidal ideation, self-harm, impaired concentration, confusion, depression, anxiety, aggression, paranoia, hallucinations, and hypersensitivity to stimuli. It's also even been known to result in full-blown psychosis requiring hospitalization. And really shocking statistic is that individuals in solitary confinement make up 5% of the prison population, but almost 50% of suicides. And according to one study in New York, individuals in solitary confinement are 7 times more likely to harm themselves, usually as a result of wanting to express some kind of control over their environment, over which they have next to little control. This is because when if an individual harms themselves in solitary confinement, prison guards have to do what's called an extraction, where they extract them from their cell and bring them for medical treatment. Prolonged isolation, not surprisingly, can both aggravate pre-existing mental illness and lead to mental illness in previously healthy individuals. The most famous example being the tragic case of Khalif Browder, who spent 3 years at Rikers Island for a crime he didn't commit, and 2 of those years he spent in solitary confinement. As known, he took his life some years after having all the charges dropped on his case. Some other issues related to the solitary confinement of individuals with disabilities include the fact that inmates with a disability are more likely to experience worsening health and mental health conditions while in solitary confinement. Factors contributing to physical deterioration, besides the common physiological effects associated with solitary confinement, include the inability of individuals with a disability to perform self-care activities while in solitary confinement, disruptions to their medical and physical therapies, and the fact that they have limited to no physical activity. And some of the most horrific cases have occurred where, due to the size of the isolation cells, some inmates with wheelchairs were literally unable to move whatsoever because essentially their cell could only fit them in the wheelchair. On the other hand, other facilities ban all ambulatory devices due to so-called security concerns, which has led, in other cases, inmates with physical disabilities absolutely no accommodations, and they've literally been reduced to having to crawl on the floor to move around. Solitary confinement is also related to release and recidivism. A number of studies have shown that individuals who have spent time in solitary confinement are more likely to be incarcerated again. Hypersensitivity to stimuli can also become permanent, meaning that inmates will have difficulties readjusting not only to general population inside prisons, but also to the outside world. Individuals with disabilities are also more likely to become homeless and much more likely to be unemployed than their non-disabled counterparts. Not surprisingly, adding a criminal record makes it even harder to find employment and housing. So what are the implications for our profession? More resources need to be invested in keeping people with disabilities from entering the criminal justice system. This could look like training for law enforcement officials so that they know how to interact with people with disabilities. As we know, people with disabilities are not only more likely to become incarcerated, but also more likely to be killed by the police than non-disabled people. And prisons and jails also just cannot be our primary mental health delivery system, as we saw with the graph about deinstitutionalization. Prisons and jails are actually the number one source of mental health treatment, I guess we can say, for people with a mental health condition. And we also have to end the criminalization of homelessness. This means ending policies that disproportionately affect individuals who are homeless and disproportionately incarcerate them. Convicted individuals with disabilities should also be diverted from prison through alternatives to incarceration. They should be provided with resources and social services, not jail time, prison time. People with disabilities should also have accessible facilities in prison and jail, and they should never be placed in solitary confinement due to a lack of accommodations or quote unquote, for their own safety. Individuals with serious mental illness should also not be placed in solitary confinement, as it is supremely unethical and truly contrary to any notion of treatment or rehabilitation. And I think in general we need to demand for a phasing out of solitary confinement in our criminal justice system. Finally, we should support successful reentry for individuals who are incarcerated, including specialized services for individuals with disabilities, given the more numerous barriers that they face compared to their non-disabled counterparts in regards to reentering the community, finding a job, finding housing, and just generally readjusting.